Hi everyone, this is Nia. Today I'll be painting these bunnies. Lunar New Year is approaching and up next is the Year of the Rabbit, so I decided to paint an oriental style rabbit illustration for the occasion. This is the reference image that inspired me to create this composition. I think it might be from a fabric pattern or a pattern from an origami paper, but I just love the elements included, especially these two specific bunnies, so I decided to make this the main focal point and take the other elements to turn this pattern into my own composition. I'm using a hot press paper here and the size is quite small, it's 9.5 centimeters by 14 centimeters, and I'm going to start out by masking the sides so I can get clean edges. I'm going to start by sketching out the focal point, which are the bunnies. I'm not very good at spacing, so I decided to just simplify the bunny shapes into a silhouette, which turned out to be this rounded trapezium or triangular shape. This is so I can figure out the spacing, the position, as well as the size of the bunnies. Then once I'm happy with all those things, I'm going to loosely draw out the features of the bunnies, like the head as well as the ears, and to separate the two bunnies. I decided to place a circle behind the bunnies as the moon, and I feel like this would highlight the bunnies more as the focal point. It'll be very useful if you have a circular object that you can trace onto or a drawing compass, but for me I just tackled it as how I usually do, which is to draw a loose circle first to get the right size, and then I just slowly clean out the lines and redraw it to fix certain curves. All that's left now are the decorations to frame the focal point. I'm just going to add different types of flowers in different sizes and varied angles, as well as leaves. I'm just going to paint them front on to make it look more flat and graphic. It's also much simpler this way. For the flowers, I took inspiration from the reference image in terms of the style, but you can of course decorate it however you would like in different styles of the flowers and include different oriental patterns to suit the composition. On the bottom right, I like to start out with the larger flowers. I'm just drawing them out as 5-petaled flowers. I'm also including another type of flower, which is dahlias, and after I have the larger ones down, it's much easier for me to fill in the rest of the space with the smaller ones. I want this to have a diagonal composition, so I'm going to add more flowers on the top left corner. This time I'm just making smaller 5-petaled flowers, but I'm still going to vary the size very slightly and also just pile them on together. As I get closer to the bunnies though, I'm going to scatter them more, so it looks like the flowers are gracefully falling with a few loose petals as well as leaves. The composition is slowly coming together and I'm liking the balance, so here I'm going to clean out the outline for the bunnies. The reason why I didn't do it earlier is because there was still a chance I didn't like the balance and I would like to move things around. So now that I'm happy with the overall composition, I feel comfortable enough to finalize the position of the bunnies. For an extra decorative element, I decided to add this swirl around the bunnies, which I'm going to paint using a bit of gold shimmer at the end. And I just feel like this brings out a little bit more movement as well as dynamic to the composition. After that, I just had a look at the composition again as a whole and decided to add one more flower and a few loose petals and leaves. And that's it for the outline. Next, I'll go over the colors. This is Vermilion by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke. I'll also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Finally, for accents, I'm also going to be using my Finetech Gold palette. Now, all there is to it is just to color everything in. I'm going to start out by painting the moon from using a mix of New Gamboge with Titanium Gold Ochre. I want generally just a medium consistency with quite a heavy load because we are painting on a large surface here, and I'm using my round brush so we can paint right into the tiny edges. I use watercolors to paint this whole composition, but I feel like it'll work better with gouache for a flatter, more even distribution of color, which will make the painting look more graphic. So keep that in mind. You might want to use gouache. It will take a bit longer to color it in because it doesn't glide as quickly as watercolors, but I feel like you can get a much neater outcome. Since I'm just going to color the whole thing in with flat colors, if I am painting a large area like the moon here, I do want to make sure that I've mixed enough paint to cover that whole area. This way you don't have to keep mixing in the middle of painting it if you haven't finished, because there might be a chance you can't make the exact same tone. To get to the very small corners, it's best to angle the tip of your brush to face the corner or the edge you're going to paint. This way, if you accidentally put too much pressure on the tip, the part of your brush which is facing the edge will still be the tiniest area. This way you won't make too much of a mess. You can also rotate your paper around so you don't have to twist your wrist in uncomfortable positions. Since this painting is really simple to paint in terms of technicalities, I'm just trying to get everything as flat looking as possible. So I hope you guys will just enjoy watching this painting come together without too much talking. After I've covered the whole moon, you can see a bit of streakiness where the color is maybe a little bit lighter than other areas. So I'm going to go back in with a little bit more paint to cover those areas and try to make this as even as possible. Next, I'm going to create a pink from a mix of Vermilion with Jaune Brilliant Dark. And I'm going to use a medium to thin consistency to paint this large 5-petaled flower. I'm going to create a different tone of pink. This time I'm going to lighten it by adding Chinese white into the previous pink mix, and I'm going to paint this on the medium-sized 5-petaled flower. After that, I want to wait for the base color to completely dry. Then I use a mix of those two pinks, and I use the tip of my brush to paint on lines at the center of the petals. Next, I'm going to create a muted red color by using Vermilion Burnt Umber with a little bit of Chinese white, and I'm going to use the consistency of this to paint the leaf shapes inside of the large flower. I'm also going to use a thick consistency of the same red mix to paint the center of the dahlias. Then I'm going to clean my brush and switch to the mid-tone pink and use a thick consistency of it to paint the petals at the center. I'm painting the small areas with a really light brush load. This way the colors will dry off quite quickly. If not, you can also dry it off with a hairdryer first and move on to paint the rest of the petals, in which case I'll be using the exact same pink in a thin consistency. For the smaller flowers, I'll be using this muted creamy color from a mix of burnt umber and titanium gold ochre, and I'm going to use a very thin consistency of it to paint all of the small flowers. I'm also going to paint the petals with the same color. Next here, I'm using the same mix but in a slightly thicker consistency and more burnt umber in the ratio to create a darker value, and I'm going to use this to paint on lines as details for the center of the flower petals. You want the base color to mostly be dry to paint this on, or else it will just blend with the rest of the base color. So if yours is still wet, you can dry it off first using a hair dryer. In terms of the lines, I'm using the same brush because my brush still comes to a very fine point, but you can always switch to a smaller brush to make it a bit easier to control painting the really thin lines, or you can even use a very sharp colored pencil for this. I'm going to add a bit more detail to the center of the flowers. For this, I use the same mix with more burnt umber in the ratio. And again, I'm using the tip of my brush, and this time to paint on dots as the stamen of the flowers. Next, I'm going to be painting on the leaves. For the green, I used Terre Verte as the base color. Then I added new Gamboge, Jaune Brilliant Dark, as well as a bit of burnt umber to mute the color. To paint the leaves, I'm going to use a light to medium load just so it glides easier, and you can always play around with the ratio slightly to change the tone of the leaves. So if I want a slightly more yellow-green, I would just add more new Gamboge in the ratio, so you can see some are a bit more muted with a cooler temperature and some are a bit warmer in my composition. I know when I was creating the outline, I didn't really draw on too many leaves, and that's because I know I can freehand some of them according to what looks good after I've colored everything in. So here I'm just going to add some smaller leaves to make the cluster of small flowers a bit more condensed, and I'm going to add larger leaves near the large flowers. Then using the same green mixture with added burnt umber, I'm going to use a thick consistency to paint on the midribs and the veins very lightly. Again, you can either switch to a smaller brush to paint this on, or even use colored pencils. Now going back to the thick consistency of the muted red mix from vermilion and burnt umber, I'm going to use this to outline the dahlias. I'm going to outline each of the petals to separate them. However, I think this would look really nice if you have a similar color pen. Using a brush creates different weights when outlining, which is good in some aspects, but for this case, I feel like the same weight of stroke will give it a cleaner look. Next, I'm also going to add details to the other flowers. I'm using a thick consistency of bleed-proof white to first add some lines on the leaf section of this large flower. Then I use the muted red mix from vermilion and burnt umber to paint on circles as the stamen for the larger flowers. For the light pink flower, I use the same pink mix as before, and I'm just going to paint on lines for added detail to the petals. As for the bunnies, I'm only going to color in the eyes by using the muted red mix from vermilion and burnt umber. So I've painted all of the elements. Now I'm going to move on to paint the background. For this, I'm going to use indigo, and I'm trying to just spread it as neatly as possible. For the larger areas, I like to paint it on using my filbert brush just to cover a little bit more area, whereas for the areas where there are a lot of details, I like to use my round brush. It was actually really difficult for me to get the colors to even out for the background since it's such a large portion and there are a lot of things going on in the foreground. So maybe even if you paint all the flowers and the other features using watercolor, you can still use gouache to paint the background. I just feel like this would make a huge difference in getting an even distribution of color. For these small flowers, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but I actually want the ends of each petal to have dips. I didn't paint them earlier or sketch them out because it would make the initial sketch more complicated. So as I'm painting the background and I come across the smaller flowers, I would just add a little bit more indigo at the ends to create those dips manually. If you are going to paint this with watercolors like I am, I would suggest for you to paint per section, which makes it easier to distribute the colors evenly without worrying about a certain part drying off before the rest, which is the main cause of the streakiness. But anyway, from here on, I'm just going to continue to paint the rest of the background while adding the little dips to the small cream flowers. I decided to paint the background near the cluster of small flowers last, and hopefully you guys can also see it a little bit clearer what I meant before when I mentioned about the dips to the ends of each petal. And here I'm just going to paint between the bunnies where there's a little bit of gap of the moon showing as well as the indigo. After this, I'm going to take off the masking tape, but before that, I make sure everything's completely dry first. Since the swirls that I drew out earlier with pencil is gone behind the indigo, I'm just going to freehand it using bleed-proof white in a thick consistency, and I want this to be the base before I paint on the gold to make the gold look more opaque. It's completely up to you how many lines you want to draw out. I'm just going to double it up, but you can also make more if you would like to and if you have more space. While I wait for the bleed-proof white to dry, I'm going to outline the bunnies using a thick consistency of new Gamboge, and I just want to get rid of the pencil marks. I was just experimenting with this, but after I reach the outer portion of the bunny where it doesn't really touch the moon anymore, I decided to change the outline using a thick consistency of vermilion. When I was painting on the white swirls, I actually really like how it looked, but I want the swirls to go out of the indigo border, which is why I decided to stick with my original idea and paint over the white swirls with gold. I'm using a thick consistency of this gold, and it was actually quite tricky for me. I find that it doesn't glide too well, which is why the lines are a bit messy, as you can see. You can paint this slower, but personally, when I was painting this, I really need to do this quickly because it was a really cloudy day and it was about to rain, so I didn't want to run out of daylight. But for your case, if you do have the time and patience, please take your time painting on the gold because it makes a huge difference to paint neatly when it comes to these types of flat two-dimensional paintings. For some of the flowers and the leaves, I like to personally extend it outwards beyond the indigo border. I find that this makes the composition come to life a bit more and just overall a bit more exciting. I also want to add outlines to the flowers and the leaves or the decorative elements, but I wasn't too sure at this point which color I want to use for those specific outlines, so I ended up just mixing things up and experimenting as I go. It's completely up to you which color you want to use. As you can see, I started out by using bleed-proof white as the outlines. I find that this works out well for certain parts like the leaves because of its dark color, but for the soft colored flowers, I found that the white outline ended up making the flowers look bulky, so at the very end I actually re-outlined the small flowers with indigo. I also want to add more shimmer to the composition, so I decided to outline the moon using a thick consistency of the gold as well. But just like before, please paint the outline slowly and neatly. Mine wasn't as neat as it should be, and it's very visible here on the left side as I'm editing and voice-overing, but it wasn't really something that I noticed because I was trying to paint this too quickly. For the last final detail, I decided to add white dots as snow, especially near the flowers, just gracefully falling slowly with the petals. I tried to vary the size of the dots, and just like the flowers before, I tried to place them diagonally to enhance the diagonal composition. And that's pretty much it, but here I just want to finish off with a few loose tiny leaves, and then this is where I fix the outline by using indigo for the flowers. But that's completely up to you. You can outline it however you would like to. It would also look great with gold. I'm guessing if you have gold pen, that would be great. So that's it. I'm just going to outline the last few petals. This was actually more challenging than I thought it would be, probably because I'm not used to the style and some parts ended up a bit more streaky than I want them to be. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed painting this one and I'm quite happy with the overall color combination and how it looks. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links and the link to my coffee outline will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!